The Death Mage Who Doesn't Want a Fourth Time. Chapter 91. It would have been good if nothing happened, but... In terms of actually protecting the village, the battle to defend the 7th Cultivation Village from Karkan's unit of knights disguised as bandits was going well. By the time Vandaloo killed Karkan, half of the 30 archers and infantry surrounding the village had already been killed. Oh! A golem! What the hell is this slime? The equestrians who were on standby after surrounding the village should have only been needed to shoot the villagers who had barely escaped with their lives. The only things that approached them were stone golems and golems made of liquid death iron, which looked like slimes at first glance. The golems that Vandaloo had diligently made and placed in the ground were 10 rank 3 stone golems and 3 rank 7 liquid death iron golems. All of them were affected by his strengthened followers and strengthened subordinates skills. They were as powerful as monsters 1 or 2 ranks above them. If the equestrians were all gathered together, even if they couldn't defeat the golems, at least half of them would have been able to escape, because the golems were slow to move. But because they had been surrounding the village, they were all separated. Why are there so many golems and black slimes in a place where there are only supposed to be goblins? Shouted the final knight before being covered and engulfed completely by a death iron golem. The death iron was a liquid, but it was just as heavy as the iron it had originally been made from. And since the golem had its own superhuman strength as well, escape after being swallowed by it would be impossible without a tremendous amount of physical strength. And then the golems groaned as they carried the equestrians' corpses to the small-scale dungeon that Vandaloo had created in order to hide them. Cassim and his party were putting up a good fight against the 10 mounted bandits. Ah! Stone shield! Shield bash! Unable to withstand the blow of Cassim's strengthened shield that he swung with all of his might, one of the equestrians fell off his horse. Zeno aimed for that fallen equestrian, but one of the other equestrians stood in his way, blocking his line of fire. "Ah, are you trying to show off?" shouted the equestrian. Fortunately for him, the leather armor he was wearing was lighter than what he normally used, so he got to his feet quickly. As usual, Cassim's skill level was too low to use Shield Bash. "It's the embodiment of my fighting spirit!" he yelled back. They were being forced to fight 3 against 10. They wouldn't last without some fighting spirit. Fester was swinging his sword bravely next to Cassim as well. "Ah! Lena, I'll protect you! Triple thrust!" He used a swordsmanship martial skill, releasing 3 swift consecutive thrusts, aiming at one of the enemies on horseback. The equestrian twisted his body to avoid the first thrust, deflected the second with his own sword, and was hit by the third, though the third thrust only took a little flesh off his side. "There's your weakness?" Triple thrust was a martial technique with 3 consecutive thrusts at a fearsome speed. But once the 3 thrusts were endured, there was an opening where the user was vulnerable. The equestrian knew this and had planned to launch a counterattack after enduring the 3 thrusts, despite having suffered a slight wound. But all of his vitality was taken away by what was supposed to have been a light wound in his side, sapping his strength. This was the effect of the bloodshed enhancement enchantment on Fester's sword. Zia! Finding the equestrian's opening instead, his regular thrust slipped through a gap in the equestrian's armor. The equestrian's eyes rolled back as he fell off his horse. "Anton!" "Who's next?" Fester roared. "Come at me! I won't let you lay a single finger on Lena!" He was making full use of Vandaloo's advice to endure the mental shock of having killed someone for the first time. "Who is that?" The equestrians were shaken after watching their ally fall. "This is for Anton!" an equestrian shouted as he and another equestrian charged at Fester. "You idiot! What are you provoking them for?" said Zeno. "Provocation!" Zeno's arrows kept the equestrians at bay, while Cassim used provocation, a martial skill that forcibly directed an enemy's hostility to himself. "These guys are stronger than we heard they would be," the unit's vice-captain whispered to himself. Cassim and his party were strong. The three of them were E-class adventurers, but they already had abilities worthy of D-class. In terms of ability, they were more than a match for the equestrians. With Vandalu's enchantments added to their equipment, they had become threats that could not be taken lightly, even 10 against 3. To the point that the vice-captain now feared that they would all be individually defeated as a result of having split up to aim for the villagers. What is taking Captain Karkan so long? The equestrians were supposed to have charged through both the front and back gates, cause chaos and crush every adventurer and villager that tried to resist. But at this rate, even if they weren't defeated, they would suffer heavy losses. Thinking that it would be bad if more casualties were suffered, the vice-captain of the unit turned to give orders to the agitated equestrians. "I'll deal with that swordsman. 2 of you keep the shield-bearer busy, and the rest of you take care of that archer," he shouted, riding his horse towards Fester. As someone with the job and social position of a true knight like Karkan, he possessed greater abilities than Fester. He would not be defeated easily if he utilized his advantage of being on horseback, even with the enchantments on Fester's equipment. "Shit! Zeno, try to run around!" Fester shouted as he moved to engage the vice-captain. And then he felt something flying over his head at incredible speeds. The head of the enemy he was trying to engage vanished with the sound of a bursting fruit. Huh? Fester and the equestrians let out foolish-sounding noises of surprise. Not noticing that its master's head had exploded, the vice-captain's horse continued running right past Fester. The long sword dropped from the vice-captain's shaking hand. "I almost hit the horse. It's hard to aim this telekinesis rifle, even though it could be useful, because I don't have to worry about the bullets exploding, since they're made of liquid death iron. I suppose it's no use without a gun barrel," said a voice from overhead. Everyone looked up to see Vandalu floating there, surrounded by several black fist-sized spheres floating around him. "Well then, I'll go for the remaining ones the normal way." Before the very eyes of the equestrians, who still had not recovered from their astonishment, numerous black spears of flames appeared around Vandalu. "Wait!" "Black flame spear." Starting with the one who looked like he was about to surrender, Vandalu released his magic at all of the equestrians, one by one. "Hang on! Oi, weren't they trying to surrender?" Cassim shouted. "Sorry, I couldn't stop myself in time," said Vandalu. He had lied so many times now that he was starting to feel bad, but there was no helping it. "I see. Well, I suppose it was just my imagination. They were still holding their weapons after all," said Cassim, having lost interest in the equestrians who were now corpses. From his perspective, the equestrians were simply bandits, so he hadn't had any intention of criticizing Vandalu for killing them mercilessly to begin with. It seemed that he had simply shouted out in surprise. "You saved us. If you were any later, things could have gone badly. It's the second time you've saved us now," he said. "Is this all of them?" asked Zeno. "Well, then, we need to clean up the corpses and gather the horses inside to make sure they don't run away." "Fester, you go and explain what's happening to the village chief," said Zeno. "Leave it to me," said Fester, struggling to speak. "There is one bandit who escaped, so I'm going to chase after him," said Vandalu. "Are you all right on your own?" I think you are, but do you want help with anything?" asked Cassim. "It's fine. Rather than help me, I will ask you to take care of things here." "All right." Cassim watched Vandaloo fly off and then grimaced as he realized that he had to pick up the broken fragments of the enemy's heads that Vandaloo had smashed to pieces. "I should have asked him to just burn them all," he muttered to himself. Terrified at the fact that his body refused to move as if it was now made of stone, Frodo looked in despair at the countless compound eyes that were gazing at him. Rank 3 paralyzing moths that scattered scales with paralyzing venoms from their wings. Rank 2 carrion flies that used their acidic saliva to dissolve weakened creatures as they consumed them. Rank 3 clear dragon butterflies, which could turn transparent for short periods of time. Rank 4 chameleon mantises, the assassins of the forest. And then there were the rank 5 cemetery bees that had poisonous stingers and jaws that could destroy metal armor as if they were decorative pieces of candy, as well as a rank 4 lance centipede with horns and a carapace tougher than iron. To Frodo, the sounds of their jaws and wings sounded like a countdown to his death. He was an outstanding mage, but since he was fundamentally a researcher, he had little experience in real battles. Karkan had brought him not for his ability in battle, but because he knew all of the villagers' faces. Even so, he might have been able to manage to repel the small number of monsters present except for the cemetery bees and the lance centipede. If only there was one type of venom to deal with, he might have been able to counteract it. But even though the monsters were all insectoids, Frodo didn't have the strength to fight against over a dozen monsters of different races, nor did he have the ability to counteract multiple types of venoms. "This cannot be! Someone, please save me! I'm not the kind of person that can be allowed to die in a place like this. My death would be an immeasurable loss for this nation." His eyeballs, the only moving part of his body, searched for help, but there were no signs that any help would come. Karkan, Frodo's superior, had been killed right at the beginning, and his subordinates had quickly shared the same fate. Frodo had the feeling that the spy had been among them. Considering that, it was likely that all of the other equestrians had been slaughtered by Vandaloo as well. Even if there were survivors, they were not close enough to Frodo to come and save him, and even if they did come, it was too difficult to imagine that they would be able to defeat these monsters. Just as Frodo gave up hope, a crimson and purple eye appeared from behind the insectoid monsters. "It's been a while," said Vandaloo. He had killed Karkan and his men in a flash, and now he was looking down at Frodo. There was no emotion in his voice or on his face. Unable to speak, Frodo screamed internally. "I've heard the gist of the story from the spirit of the man named Karkan," Vandaloo continued, extending his hand toward Frodo. "You were a hired mage who infiltrated the cultivation villages in order to destroy them, not a priest. Your objective was to gain a better position for yourself, it seems." "He knows everything? He was a spiritualist as well?" Frodo felt surprise and fear and cursed Karkan in his mind for selling him out so quickly after dying and becoming a spirit. "Wait, I stopped. I knew this attack was pointless, but Karkan forced me into it." Before this attack, several of the other cultivation villages were supposed to have been destroyed by plans that Frodo had put into place himself, and he had conveniently forgotten this. But his tongue, paralyzed by the venom, was unable to produce any words. "It seems that you have something to say, but there is nothing that I want to hear from you," said Vandaloo. "But you really have done something troublesome." He had repelled bandits to protect the village. There would be no problem with that. But the fact that the bandits were actually knights was a problem. Normally, Karkan and his men would have been treated as a shame to all knights, but there was the fact that the cultivation project to alleviate the refugee problem was actually a plan to leave the people to fend for themselves, and the fact that Karkan had been acting according to Lucas's will, even if he had been making decisions mostly independently towards the end. Thus, it did not seem that things would end so simply. It seemed that they had come out on the pretense of going on an expedition, but it was certain that the people of the Knights' Order would realize that the missing Karkan and his men were the bandits who had been massacred in the cultivation villages. When that happened, what would they do? It would be convenient for Vandaloo and the cultivation villages if they didn't make a move. If the Knights' Order and the noblemen acted as if nothing happened and treated the death of Karkan and his men as them having gone missing during an expedition, then nothing would happen. However, considering what had happened up until now, Vandaloo had no faith in the Hartner family, nor the nobles close to the Hartner family. They would definitely try something. If I knew they were knights before I killed them, I could have taken them alive and possibly tried various things to cover it up. But your disguises were too elaborate, said Vandaloo. To actually die so quickly, like real bandits. I suppose going as far as to say that would be unreasonable. Vandaloo's hand drew steadily closer to Frodo. Frodo was waiting in suspense, wondering when black flames would appear from that hand, when claws would extend from its fingers. But that didn't happen. Vandaloo's hand lifted Frodo's face up. Frodo wondered whether he was being spared. "Thank you, truly thank you. I'll tell you everything I know. I'll do anything for your sake, so Insects silently emerged from Vandaloo's cold hand that was touching Frodo's cheek. Just as Frodo saw the eyeless heads of numerous colorful, venomous-looking worms coming out of Vandaloo's hand, their long bodies began twisting and crawling over his face. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" said Vandaloo. "These are the creatures that live as parasites in the bodies of other creatures. They can infest all kinds of places, like the brain or other internal organs. I'll tell you now that your consciousness will not be taken over. You will feel the pain and everything else quite vividly." The slimy, parasitic creatures began entering Frodo's body through his mouth, nose, and ears. He let out stifled screams. Watching him tremble and convulse ominously, Vandaloo made a confession. "I'll say this now, because perhaps you haven't noticed. I am very angry." Vandaloo felt anger and disappointment at Frodo's betrayal. He had admired Frodo and thought he was a good person for a believer from Alda. But he had betrayed Vandaloo like this. Vandaloo wanted to erase the past where he had worried for Frodo's safety. "Well, as you were a spy to begin with, I'm sure you thought that I was a fool for not noticing," Vandaloo continued. "Your eyes are telling me that I was a fool to be deceived, too." "I'm not thinking anything like that!" The voice of Frodo, who was still alive, could not be heard by Vandaloo. Vandaloo waited for the parasites to finish infesting Frodo and then grabbed his body. And then Frodo's body silently began entering Vandaloo's hand. "What will happen to me? Someone save me!" With his screams unheard by anyone, Frodo disappeared inside Vandaloo. "This is an underhanded trick, but I can equip creatures infested by parasitic insects with insect binding technique," Vandaloo explained. In order to use dungeons to transport the ghouls who had been living in the devil's nests of the Hartner Duchy, and the livestock he had received in trade with the farming villages, Vandaloo had made parasites infest them, equipping them inside of his body, and then teleported to Talosheim. Of course, he only had to use a single harmless parasite for each person, only having infested them just before teleporting and then quickly releasing them straight after arriving in Talosheim. If Vandaloo transported Frodo to Talosheim alive and disposed of him there, his corpse would not be found by the villagers, nor would there even be a sliver of a chance of him appearing near the village if he turned into a ghost. Death Attribute Charm was not flawless, so Vandaloo was sure to take precautions where he could. But perhaps his capacity had decreased after equipping Frodo. He was now one insect short of equipping all of them. I suppose unexpected troublesome situations like this arise if I equip so many insects close to my limit, Vandaloo murmured. Click, click, click. Pete seemed to be asking what they could do. Now that his rank had increased and he had become a lance centipede, he was now larger than an anaconda. Well, the gatekeepers already saw you, so I'm sure it will be fine. Vandaloo might be scolded a little, but it would probably be fine for him to bring Pete with him. Once the bandits are all disposed of, I have to set some lemures around Niarchy and Nineland. Then I have to release some undead insects and... Vandaloo's words trailed off as he let out a sigh. The villagers of the 7th Cultivation Village were shocked by the bandit attack and praised Vandaloo and Cassim's party for defending them. It was still morning, so there wasn't a feast thrown to celebrate. They stripped the bandits of their equipment, had Vandaloo burn the corpses and bury the ashes so they would not rise as undead, and gathered all of the horses. Then it was noon and the celebrations began. "Don't go screaming my name like that," said Lena. But I was desperate to protect you," Fester told her. "So I'm telling you, don't go shouting that to everyone. Say it when we're alone together." Fester seemed to have recovered from the mental shock of having killed someone for the first time, and his relationship with Lena was moving forward as well. Apparently, a couple consisting of an Adventurers Guild employee and an active adventurer could not get married until one of them retired, so their goal was still far off, however. "I don't really get it," said Cassim, "but I did know that he's liked Lena for a while." "More than not really getting it, it's just lonely," said Zeno. "Being single, that is." "Did you know that Morris went and got engaged at that age, apparently?" "Yeah, with his childhood friend. I wonder how you get a girlfriend." Cassim and Zeno were both staring into the distance. "That reminds me, Braga and his single companions were saying the same thing until this spring," thought Vandaloo. "Vandaloo, you probably don't understand at your age, but make sure you get along with girls," Cassim told him. "I'll do that." This was the only response Vandaloo could give, as he imagined how they would complain if they learned of his circumstances. Also, he was staying silent about Frodo, who was currently convulsing inside of his body. After that, Lena, as an employee of the village's branch of the Adventurers Guild, reported that 20 bandits had been repelled and paid Cassim's party the reward. The villagers didn't even know about the existence of the other third party that had been defeated by the golems. The horses that Karkan and his men had been riding were all now Vandaloo's. He was the one who had defeated most of the bandits, after all, so the reward went to Cassim and Vandaloo got the horses. But Vandaloo had no use for horses, so he divided them among the cultivation villages. They would live new lives as farming horses. "I'm currently still just a civilian, so if I receive money, it would count as doing business, and I would have to pay taxes. So please, just pay however much you want to the adventurers," Vandaloo told the people of the other villages.
Are you sure about that? We don't really have anything we can offer you as collateral."
"It's fine. I'm leaving all of the responsibilities of taking care of the horses to you, after all. And besides, if Vandaloo brought living horses back, Sam would be upset. Vandaloo had accidentally been given a farming horse when he was collecting livestock from this region's villages. This was the conversation that had taken place when he brought that horse back to Talosheim. "Bochan, you have me, and yet you would use a living horse as your legs?" "Sam, you don't have to say it like you're reprimanding your husband for having an affair." It seemed that Sam felt threatened by the fact that Vandaloo could spend long hours flying through the sky, and had now even gained the ability to teleport between dungeons. Maybe I should register at the Commerce Guild as a horse leasing business. This idea suddenly occurred to Vandaloo, but where he had obtained the horses would be problematic to explain, so it was probably best to see how things went for a while. After that, having prepared themselves mentally during the fight against the bandits, Kasim's party apparently managed to get through their D-class promotion exam that they took in the city of Niarki. At that point in time, nothing had happened yet. The levels of the insect binding technique, coordination, strength of subordinates, strength and followers, death attribute charm, and throwing skills have increased. You have acquired the thread refining skill. Shortly after the new year, Lord Lucas looked at his completely petrified subordinate, feeling no desire to bring his mouth to the mulled wine that had been poured into his cup. Lord Lucas's office preserved the heat well, but his subordinate looked as if his innards had frozen solid. His face and shoulders were completely stiff. Perhaps it was not Lord Lucas that needed the hot wine, but this subordinate. However, it was not warmth, but a businesslike question that Lord Lucas gave. So, where is Karkan Lassen and his unit? The subordinate's face stiffened even further. The problem was that the knight named Karkan Lassen, who had planned to go on a 2-week expedition, as well as his entire unit, had gone missing. To Lord Lucas himself, Carcass's name and face were things that he could barely recall from the corner of his mind. Karkan was the man in charge of one of the background operations conducted in Lord Lucas's dispute with his younger brother, Belton, over the succession of the Hartner family. Karkan was a man from the Lawson family who had served as knights for the Hartner family for generations. In other words, he was a man from a family who had never risen above the mere status of knights despite being around for generations. A very ordinary knight. Of course, there was nothing wrong with being a mere knight. They had the splendid duty of protecting the land from monsters, criminals, and enemy nations, as well as acting as role models for the soldiers and the people. However, Karkan had desired a position above his own ability. The petrified subordinate before Lord Lucas, the captain of the Red Wolf's Knights Order, Pablo Martin, had noticed him and entrusted him with one of Lord Lucas's plans. That is, there has been no contact despite the expedition's planned duration having already passed. And when we sent people to investigate, it was found that they were not at the expedition's destination. Also, the Adventurers Guild apparently received a report that a cultivation village was attacked by around 20 bandits on horseback, but the bandits were repelled safely. I see, he said. That cultivation village was attacked by 20 wealthy bandits with horses, but they repelled them successfully. That small village. Pablo, is there any chance that there were 50 of those bandits, not 20? No, according to the Adventurers Guild's records, there were 20. However, I am thinking the same thing, said Pablo. In other words, it was likely that Karkan had led his unit out of the city, pretending to go on an expedition, then attacked the cultivation village disguised as bandits where they were defeated. A small cultivation village had annihilated a unit of 3 true knights and 50 equestrians. Even considering that they had lowered the quality of their equipment in order to disguise themselves as bandits, it was difficult to believe. However, numerous unbelievable events had occurred in the Hartner Duchy last year. Both the actions Karkan had taken and the fate that he had met were nothing more than more of these unbelievable events. I believe I ordered him not to lay a hand on the cultivation villages. No, I believe I ordered the cancellation of every secret plan after Belton's scandal, did I not? Asked Lord Lucas. Lord Lucas had ordered all of his secret plans to be cancelled, knowing that it was no longer the time for him and Lord Belton to be pulling at each other's feet. Belton himself was apparently innocent, but the fact that several influential noblemen had connections to the pure-breed vampires caused an unbelievable scandal. If this wasn't dealt with correctly, it wasn't a matter of the Hartner family losing the trust of the other Duke families. It was more than possible that many would demand that the Hartner family's status as a family of dukes be revoked. No, before that, perhaps rebellions would begin occurring all over the duchy. It was a critical moment that could have spelled the end of the Hartner family if Lord Lucas and Lord Belton had continued dragging each other down. Which was why Lord Lucas had ordered all of the secret plans to be cancelled, but why had Karkan made a move?
That is, it seems that he was desperate for success, said Pablo.
I see. With people like this selected to work for us, I suppose it cannot be helped that things turned out this way. Lord Lucas sighed as he thought about how to deal with this problem. It would not be good to treat all of them as having gone missing in an accident during their expedition. It wouldn't be good, but it wouldn't be a big problem either. The equestrians, led by Karkan, were apprentices of knights. There were the second and third sons of noble families among them as well. Of course, their families were those that supported Lord Lucas. Naturally, they knew of the conflict between the brothers. That was why they would probably not be satisfied with the explanation that they had simply gone missing. Although it would cause some displeasure, it would be possible to silence them by brandishing the power of the nation. However, the problem was that there was something ominous going on in this cultivation village. "What do you think of the people in this cultivation village?" Lord Lucas asked.
Most likely they are threatening us, perhaps, said Pablo.
My thoughts exactly, said Lord Lucas. The Adventurers Guild had received news that it was 20, not 50 bandits. Lord Lucas interpreted this as the cultivation village declaring to him, "You know that we're keeping quiet about this for you, don't you?" In fact, a scandal at a time like this would be bad. Normally, scandals would be dealt with one way or another, but the king and the other dukes were currently scrutinizing the Hartner duchy. There was no telling what kind of faults they would find with the Hartner family. That was why knowing the truth behind the incident was more than enough for the cultivation village to blackmail him. Thus, Lord Lucas thought that the villagers and adventurers from the village somehow managed to kill Karkan and his men in retaliation. If Lord Lucas and Pablo had received a detailed report on Vandaloo, they would have come to a different conclusion. However, until the moment of his death, Karkan had believed that Vandaloo was someone who could be dealt with by his unit alone, so he hadn't provided much detail in his reports out of fear that his ability would be doubted.
Perhaps the knights of the Sauron duchy were among the refugees, Pablo suggested. It could even be that they are planning to establish their own independent power. There are no devil's nests around there, and that incident occurred in that slave-run mine, so not many will approach those villages from now on.
Lord Lucas sighed as he listened to Pablo's words, realizing that he couldn't just leave the cultivation village alone after all. He had treated the refugees cruelly and tried to turn them into disposable, low-grade soldiers, and he had even intended to use secret plans to destroy several of the other cultivation villages. Thus, he was now unconsciously thinking of this village as an enemy that would harm him if given the opportunity. And he couldn't leave these people from the Sauron duchy alone when they possessed an unknown amount of military might and political power in the Hartner duchy that he would soon be in charge of. "Pablo, this is your responsibility," said Lord Lucas. "Use the Red Wolf's knight's orders to deal with this.